welcome to today's session. My name is Ken Moragori. I'm a trainer with the Kenya Airlift program. So today we'll be handling critical reasoning, verbal reasoning, and specifically how to understand the logical critical reasoning question types. So we know there are multiple question types in critical reasoning. All of them need different approaches, but we say a lot of times that the strategy for handling critical reasoning questions is similar. So to avoid confusion, you have to understand how the question is set and what the requirements of this question or the question that you are handling is. So the approach for different question types in CR vary. Of course, this is due to the requirements and uniqueness of each question stem. You will find that each question stem will have different parts of the stimulus and presented in different ways. So it becomes very important to know how to approach your question without confusion. Most of the times you find we solve a certain question the wrong way because we're used to solve a certain question type that way. So you have to be able to move fluidly between question types and not be confused when moving from one question type to the other. So as I said, this is difficult because the general strategy of correctly solving critical reasoning questions is the same. So what is this strategy? One, it's testing your critical reasoning ability. So it's looking for your attention to detail. If you are careful in reading, if you are good at extracting exactly the information given without adding or subtracting any other information. So you always have to be vigilant when kind of interpreting these questions to not change the meaning or that the author intended for this question type. So parts of a critical reasoning stimulus. So we know a question has three different parts. So we have a stimulus, we have the question stem, then we have the answer choices. So the stimulus is the first part of the question, where we say it's where the passage is presented. So it is the stimulus. And then you have your question stem, then you have your answer choices. So we are concentrating on the stimulus because that's where the information that is presented changes as you move between question types. So we have the premise, which is facts. So these are a number of facts that you are given, which we assume are true. So we take these as facts, and then using these facts, you have the logic. So this is the why, and the logic now is used to draw a conclusion. So the conclusion combines the facts and then a reason why you can conclude the way you did. So in questions that have a conclusion, you always have to find the logic and the facts presented. Then inference questions, they need an inference which is kind of like you're drawing a conclusion that must be true. So this is usually not a part of the stimulus really, but it's important because you kind of have a conclusion that you're drawing yourself. So let's look at the different ways in which these questions are presented and how you should think about them. So we have these four main question types that are one, the most commonly tested in critical reasoning, and 2, they have a conclusion involved. So we want to see how do you handle the logic of each question type. So as I said, these 3 assumption, strengthen, and weaken questions, they will have a conclusion in the stimulus. The inference questions, they won't have a conclusion in the stimulus. They will just have a set of parts of statement presented, and then you will be required to draw a conclusion from these information. So just inferring something that must be true given these information. So what is the difference in introduction between the parts of a CR question for these question types? Remember, we are looking at the premise, the logic, and the conclusion. So we start with assumption questions. So of course, you have your premise, and then you have your logic that ties the premise to the conclusion. So an assumption comes here. That is where there is some missing information that the logic needs so as to draw this conclusion. So in short, an assumption now is information that is needed for the conclusion to be true. So that means if this assumption is not needed, without this assumption, the conclusion can be true. That means that is not the assumption. But if you get a statement where once the statement is taken out, the conclusion may or may not be true. Again, that's not the assumption. But if you get one that when the assumption is removed, the conclusion falls apart, that you now have doubts whether this conclusion is actually correct. So that's your assumption. So if the conclusion has the possibility of being true without the assumption, you eliminate that assumption. So for example, let's taking just a very simple example. If you have a statement that dogs are mammals, and then you have your conclusion as if you see a mammal, then it is dog. So we can clearly see that there is an assumption here. And what's that assumption is assuming that all mammals are dogs. So that means there is no any other mammal that exists, only dogs. So you can see that that's an assumption, because if we assume that all mammals are dogs, this means that our conclusion here will be true. But if we assume that that's not the case, you now doubt this conclusion because there's a possibility that it's actually not true. So that's what we are calling an assumption.
You're watching Success with Bob Mwiti Show, presented to you by Upstech America. Upstech America is a consulting company that helps immigrants find amazing higher education and job opportunities in the tech industry in the United States. You can find our programs by going to www.upstechamerica.com. Upstech America, we wake you up to the unlimited potential.
Moving on to strengthening the argument questions. So you have the same setup. You have your premise, you have the logic, and the conclusion. So what is needed from you is from the set of answers that you have, because when you are handling each answer option, you assume that it's a true fact. So you are looking for one true fact that if added to the list of facts that you have, it actually builds the conclusion. It strengthens the conclusion. It supports this conclusion. So if it does that, then you have an answer choice that strengthens the conclusion. So if we go back to our example here, we have this statement, dogs are mammals. Then we have our conclusion that any mammal that you come across, the dog. So if we take a statement like mammals are made up of only one species. So this statement is, and remember we are taking it as fact. So if you take now this as fact and this as fact, this now tells you that mammals are only made up of one species, and we know dogs are mammals, so dogs must be this one species. So our conclusion here that any mammal you see is a dog is true. So this statement strengthens our conclusion here. So that's how strengthening the argument works. And then the opposite of this is weakening. So for weaken, you have your premise, you have the logic and conclusion. So you are looking for a fact that, if true, causes you to call into question his conclusion. So you have kind of new information that you know that makes this conclusion probably not true. It's not necessarily that it will lead us to draw the conclusion that this conclusion is false. It doesn't have to be false. It just have to be probably not true. So this means that, of course, this fact can probably break the logic that was used. So the way the premise and the conclusion were connected, it kind of breaks that or gives us more information that contradicts with this conclusion. So back to our example here, we have dogs have mammals, and we have our conclusion as any mammal you see is a dog. And then now we have our extra fact in our one of the answer choices that says mammals are made up of two species. So what does this extra information do? It tells us that mammals are made up of two species, and because we know this is one fact that you're given, so one of them are dogs, then there is another species. So whenever you see a mammal, it may be a dog or it may be another species. So this means that saying any mammal you see is a dog is probably not true. It may be true because dogs are mammals, but it may also be this species X. So that now makes us question this conclusion that whatever mammal you see must be a dog. So that's how we weaken the argument. And weakening and strengthening the argument questions, they are tricky because most of the times you'll find answer options that are doing the opposite. You're handling a weaken the argument question, and then you find answer options that strengthen the argument. And because we are usually strained for time and are usually in a hurry, you may, by the time you are getting to some answer options, you may have forgotten if you're strengthening the argument or weakening the argument. So to prevent that, you can be referring back to the question then. Am I weakening? Am I strengthening? So just keeping that in mind, keeping it fresh in your mind that this question is a strengthening question so that you do not confuse and end up choosing an answer that is weakening the argument. And then the last one, the last question type here is inference. So in inference now it's a bit different from the three, but because you are presented with your set of facts. So and then the logic and the conclusion is up to you. So you have to draw a conclusion from this set of facts. So think through the set of facts that you have, and then, so of course thinking through is now building the logic, and then draw a conclusion that must be true given this set of facts. So an example is you are given, let's go back. So we said you have a set of facts, then these parties up to you. So drawing the logic and the conclusion. So back to our example, so we have dogs are mammals, and we have one of the answer options. So A is any mammal must be a dog. And then option B, any mammal may be a dog. So if you look at option A, can you infer these? And remember, whatever that you're inferring, so you are inferring to kind of draw a conclusion. So the information must be true given the facts that you have. So the only fact that we have is dogs are mammals. So saying any mammal must be a dog means that, again, you have assumed that all mammals are dogs. So you may have other animals that are mammals. So you cannot say this is true. Remember, the information that you infer must be true given your set of facts. But if you go to B, it says any mammal you see may be a dog. So kind of like there's a chance that that mammal is a dog. So it's not saying that that mammal is definitely a dog, but it may be a dog. So can you infer this from this fact? So the answer is yes. You can actually infer that because there is a chance that any mammal you see is a dog because we know dogs are mammals. So that's how inference questions work. So looking at the other question types, so there is a flow questions. So these are a bit different because you have, again, premise, logic, and conclusion. But now the logic has a mistake or a flaw. So, and this flaw now it's kind of the opposite of an assumption. So you are given a flaw question that has the logic that we had. So dogs are mammals. And then you have any mammal is a dog. So flow question require you to identify what flow is there in drawing this conclusion. So the flow here now becomes that not all mammals are dogs. So this is a flow. So the assumption that may or may not be true now becomes kind of a flaw. But mostly these flaws are very direct, kind of like mistaking a cause for an effect or something like that. And then if you look at questions like method of reasoning, so for this, you are required to, so you have premise and you have a conclusion. So you are required to find the logic. So what reasoning made the author draw this conclusion? So kind of like looking for the logic. So you can see a lot of questions in critical reasoning involve playing around with the premise, the logic, the conclusion. Some of them have facts which we kind of add to our premise. Some of them have conclusions which you must pick from the choices, which conclusion is true. So that's inference questions. Some of them want you to weaken or strengthen the conclusion, want you to find the flaw in logic, wants you to reason out why the conclusion was drawn that way. So understanding the flow of these questions is very, very key. And that's why you should be careful when reading the question so that you do not end up getting confused. And again, practice makes perfect. The more you practice, the better you'll be at identifying what's the logic, what's the assumption, what's the conclusion. So if something is out of scope, say you want something that affects the conclusion, but this specific thing doesn't affect the conclusion anyway. So practice makes perfect. Make sure you improve the quality of your study. As you practice, do not rush over questions. Take time to understand the question and how it works. If you get it wrong, try again, or just leave the question and try again after a few days. See if you can figure out the reasoning behind that question. And doing that will make your verbal study strong and you'll begin seeing improvements in your study. So that was all we had for today. And I'll see you in our next class. Bye.